I'd like to call the Community Development, Housing, and General Government Committee of August to order. Everyone's here? Last instant? As is our usual practice, we will take the consent agenda first. I will read through the demolition list, and if there is anyone here wanting to have a comment about any of those, we will get to you. All right, 1131 Miller Street, 2533 Lewis Street, 808 Moravia Street, 746 Goldfloss Street, 2508 North Patterson, and 2538 Old Greensboro Road. Okay. Are there any items that the committee would like to pull?
C6.
C6. Okay, very good, thank you. And I will pull C5 just because I understand that there are people from the Stonewall Community Association that are here. Yeah.
Madam Chair, C8 was not discussed yesterday at Finance Committee, and we requested it be held till next week.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do I have a motion on the remainder of the consent items?
Move for approval of the balance.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. All right. If the some of the folks from the Stonewall community, then you'll read that, please.
Item C5, resolution granting a no parking on the lawn ordinance pursuant to Chapter 42, Article 4, Section 42-173 of the Code of the City of Winston-Salem, the Stonewall Community Association, Incorporated.
Thank you, Ms. Stimson.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
The Stonewall community has submitted a no parking on the lawn petition. According to ordinance, there must be a total of 60% of the property owners that live within a specified area that have to sign a petition to agree to have an area declared as a no parking on the ordinance area. In this particular area, there were 119 property owners. 60% of that amount would have been 71 signatures, and we have 76. Also, per ordinance, the area has to meet or exceed 100,000 square feet, which this does. The boundaries have to be continuous without isolated sections within the area, which there are no isolated sections. A public hearing has been scheduled for August 17th as required by ordinance, and it is also located in an RS9 district, which is one of the 3 areas that it must be within. We published a public hearing notification through the website, on TV 13, and the monthly meeting calendars as was required by ordinance. Therefore, the information that was submitted is confirmed and meet the criteria to be declared.
Thank you, Ms. Stimson. If the people from the Stonewall community would just stand. And, oh, wonderful. Thank you all for coming out. And do you have a spokesman that would like to say a word? Or are you just going to save that for the public hearing? Okay, all right, thank you. Then may I have a motion on this to send to council?
During the public hearing, is that where you voice your opinion on the petition?
Yes. Yeah.
Move for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. And the next one was 6? Yeah.
Item C6, ordinance amending Chapter B of the Unified Development Ordinances to amend parking, stacking, and loading areas and landscaping and tree preservation standards in accordance with Legacy 2030 update recommendations UDO 261, proposal of the City County Planning and Development staff.
Okay. Do you want a full report on this?
I don't necessarily, Madam Chair, want a full report, but I think any time, again, when we bring ordinances and they're on the consent agenda, I think it would behoove us to have some type of 3-minute review of the specifics of what this ordinance is about.
Okay.
Okay. Let me try to, I'll go to a couple and try to be real quick. We're basically, there are 4 major changes. And they deal with cross-access drives, pedestrian access walkways, parking lot landscaping, and bicycle parking. Cross-access drives and pedestrian access walkways are organized similarly, which are allowed in certain commercial, office, and institutional districts. Pedestrian walkways are the same, but they also include multifamily zoning districts. They require that cross-access, if they're on a designated collector or thoroughfare street, they would be required to put in no more than 2 cross-access drives for the, and also would put in a 5-foot wide paved sidewalk. Now, but there are 11 exemptions for the cross-access drives and 7 exemptions for the sidewalks. So if they meet those, they do not have to construct those. And the exemptions are like topography, or is it blocked from being able to connect to the adjoining lot, et cetera. And if they meet one of those for the cross-access drives, that may limit that. Instead of 2 connections to each adjoining property, or 1 connection to 2 adjoining properties, may just be 1 or could be 0. But with the sidewalk situation, it would mean that, if it met one of the exemptions, it would not be required. So that's how that's set up. The third area is parking lot landscaping, and we have it where if you now exceed 175% of the minimum parking, say for example you have a development that's required to have a minimum of 20 parking spaces. If you're planning on putting in 40 parking spaces, which is over 100, it's 200% twice, you would be required to put in interior landscaping so that no parking space is more than 50 feet from a tree rather than 75 feet. So if you're going to do that, you're going to have to do a little extra landscape. And the other thing that Council Member Adams may be interested in, we are now including retrofits. So if an existing business is redeveloping, and this resulted from the Harris Teeter on Older Road where they tore down the former Roses and rebuilt, they were not required to do any interior parking lot landscaping. In the future, if they're going to tear down and redevelop, then they have to do some amount of parking lot landscaping, depending on how much they do. So a lot of the older areas, if somebody tears down, wants to rebuild part of it, or makes an addition, they will be required to do some parking lot landscaping. So it should help beautify some areas.
Even without increasing the parking?
But we're assuming if they do an expansion or whatever, they're going to be increasing the parking. If there's no increase in parking, then no, they would not have to do it. But assuming that expansion is going to require some parking, they would have to do it equivalent, at a minimum equivalent to what's required by the expansion. And if they're doing a major redevelopment, more than 80%, then we'd treat it as if it was a totally new development and have to meet everything. The last area which has gotten the most publicity is bicycle parking. And we're introducing now, is required in commercial, office, and multifamily districts. We limit it to future growth areas and rural areas are not required to do bicycle parking. It's only going to be in downtown's exempted, in the urban neighborhoods and suburban areas. And we have set up spaces where ratios between 1 space per 2,000 square feet to 1 space per 50,000 square feet depending on the type of use. A Lowe's would have a 1 per 50,000 square foot ratio. A general dollar store would have a 1 per 5,000, as an example. We exempt a lot of uses like construction, offices, that not like, a pest control place where they're likely to go out and visit the customer. And uses that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to require bicycle parking for a car wash. So we've exempted a good bit of them, but one where it makes sense. And, there's been some concern. We've had some feedback from, we had 2 stakeholder meetings, had some feedback from the Piedmont Triad Apartment Association, which we met a lot of their concerns. We were treating suburban apartment development slightly different than urban as far as what was required. We changed that. But they still, I think the members have a philosophical difference and said they are to be able to determine whether or not they need to provide bicycle parking or not, and that's where we kind of parted ways. But what we require is a minimum of 2 spaces, a maximum of 20 spaces, which that maximum is a lot less than other communities. Some of them require 35 to 50 spaces as a maximum. We don't think there's a need to go that far. So that is basically the major changes.
Thank you. Committee, what I think happens, like we said a lot of times, some of the ordinances, we may know what they mean and what's getting ready to happen. And then I always like to think that it helps, it never hurts to be educated over and over again. So if you're eating in a restaurant downtown or somewhere and someone asks you about it, at least we can say, well, we did discuss it in committee meeting, and because it does lend itself to what we're trying to do here in the city. We're trying to connect communities. We're trying to make them more walkable. We're trying to help give cyclists more stake in the game. And with our bike lanes and everything, we're trying to, when we do reuse of properties, whether it's the Roses or whether it's the Lowman's Plaza or the bylots where the Walmart went, we're trying to ensure that when development goes there, that it blends with what we're doing now versus what was then. Back then, nobody put trees in the middle of Thruway or anywhere else for that matter. But now we see a need to help bring and bridge the gap to where we are now and where we're going with sustainability of neighborhoods and that sort of thing. Thank you.
I want to pick up on that, and I guess I'm a little bit surprised that the apartment group owners didn't see the validity of doing this as an amenity for their clients. I know we as a city feel like we are more competitive when we accommodate cyclists more. We feel like that brings business to us. So I'm a little bit surprised that they didn't see it that way. I do really appreciate, though, the back and forth that went on. I know there was a lot of conversation with stakeholder groups, and I just really think that's a valuable way to go about these kind of things. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce had input on it, and other folks had input, so I really I thank you for doing that. The Harris Teeter on Renolda, was there actually a detail, but was there an increase in spaces there? I know they just tore a building down, put a building back up, but I don't think they really.
I don't think there's an increase in spaces, right? They use this, but we had language that would accommodate if you expanded, but not if you didn't increase the building footprint. We didn't have any language to deal with that.
So there, it may have worked in that the footprint of that building was bigger than the Roses they tore down.
Right.
So it would have triggered.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
I had a question, and this may be more generally applicable than precisely relevant to the specific changes in this package, but let me know. I see that in your motor vehicle surface area landscaping standards, page 149, that you talk about expansion, redevelopment, or replacement of existing buildings and what has to be done with parking, alternative landscaping plans, et cetera. And questions recently have been raised to me. What provisions are available for alternative building placement and parking placement when you're redeveloping an area that has a substantial existing tree cover And, the best trees are close to the street, where our current practice would encourage, pulling the buildings up closer to the street, or that kind of issue. What do we have in place to address that?
Well, I'm going to take a stab, and I'm going to look at Kurt. You want to, since he did the landscaping ordinance, he knows that a little bit better than I do.
Good afternoon, committee members. Councilmember Bessie, if I understand your question correctly, building placement is generally not fixed by the ordinance. There's only a few places, such as the pedestrian business district, which requires buildings to be pulled up to the street. The Winston Overlay District downtown requires that. The Martin Luther King Jr. Drive Overlay District on that corridor requires that. Otherwise, buildings can be placed in order to accommodate unique site characteristics, such as you mentioned, existing mature trees on site. Obviously, the city does have tree planting and preservation requirements for both residential and non-residential sites that you all adopted in 2009, and the preferred method is to preserve existing trees where appropriate. So, does that answer?
It does, sir. Thank you. That's exactly what I was asking.
I move for approval.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll go to our general agenda.
Item G1, resolution adopting guidelines for affordable workforce housing assisted with city funds.
Beat that.
Yeah,
And everybody's here.
Mr. Brooks. Did we all hear this yesterday? Okay, and finance did approve this, or this was just an information item? I don't have my finance book with me. But I think we all sort of discussed that yesterday, but it's an extraordinarily important piece. So is there anything that you feel like needs to be added, Mr. Brooks?
Mr. Brooks, did we not approve this resolution going forward with a change to it? We added something to it. Is this the one that we did that to? Anybody that was here yesterday? Because we beat this one to death.
Yes, I don't believe it was a change. I think Councilmember Montgomery said that he would support it.
To extend the 15 to 20 or
we-
to the end of the money, whatever we give them.
The term of the loan.
There was some,
term of the
there was
loan?
some conversation about tying the term, the 15-year term that is recommended to the term of the loan.
Yeah.
Right.
In conjunction with a,
I think what was approved said 15 years, but he said something about studying.
We will come back.
We
Right.
come back
We
and
come back.
study that, yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay.
so is this an action item?
Yes.
So if I have a.
Move for approval of G1 with the added condition that was approved in finance meeting yesterday.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. G2.
Update on potential accessory dwelling units ordinance amendment.
Good afternoon, committee again. The next item is a briefing on accessory dwelling provisions and amendment to those. The petitioner on this is planning and development staff in conjunction with the city attorney's office. And as I mentioned, this request would amend our existing unified developments ordinance provisions on accessory dwelling units. Just to give you all a little bit of background on this topic, accessory dwellings are, in effect, secondary dwelling units that may be either attached to a principal structure on a lot or detached, usually to the side or rear of a structure on that same lot. And they are currently allowed in the Winston-Salem city limits, but with the catch of being only allowed where several different types of occupancies exist. Currently, these units can only be applied to relatives of the owner of the primary dwelling, an adopted person, a servant, other dependent, or for attached dwellings, you also have the ability to house someone who's at least 55 years old or handicapped in those units. The city attorney's office has approached staff with concerns regarding the current occupancy limitations and their enforceability, and has asked planning staff to develop revised ordinance language. In doing a little background research on this topic, the Legacy 2030 Comprehensive Plan promotes appropriately designed and sited accessory dwellings, and those are the key terms, being appropriately designed and appropriately sited, as an option for gentle density, which is the concept of slightly increasing density in existing areas where infrastructure is already in place, areas within the municipal boundaries when a community is trying to figure out how to house additional people that are moving to a city in a limited area. So this is just one of many tools that Legacy calls for in gentle density. It also states that carefully placed accessory dwellings provide community benefits, such as being potentially more affordable than other housing options on the market, providing for aging in place for the elderly, sick, or those on fixed incomes who may no longer be able to afford, need, or want the larger structures but want to stay in the same neighborhood, and finally, generating income for the owner of the principal structure. So what staff did is we examined the accessory dwelling ordinances in our peer cities in North Carolina, basically all those large cities, and what we found is that all the large cities in North Carolina do allow accessory dwelling units in some form or fashion, with the exception of Raleigh. And in looking at their provisions, what we've done is outlined several potential elements of an accessory dwelling ordinance amendment that we could put forth here. And I'm just going to briefly run through some of those provisions. The first and foremost would be removing the kinship provisions as suggested by recent case law and brought to our attention by the attorney's office. The second being requiring a special use permit process from the Board of Adjustment that helps make sure there's a public hearing so these things just don't appear in people's backyards without there being at least tacit neighborhood approval. We're also talking about limiting these accessory units to 1,000 square feet in size, and that makes sure that they're clearly secondary to the other structures on the lot. Staff doesn't want to see this be a way that people could suddenly get 2 homes for the price of 1 on a single zoning lot. And we're also talking about limiting attached units to be no more than 30% of the floor area of the principal building. That would further limit the size to, in most cases, much smaller than 1,000 square feet for those attached units. We're also recommending limiting detached standalone units to no more than 5% of the total lot area. That also will make sure that you don't have a giant footprint in the rear yard of an already large footprint structure. Just continuing on, staff is examining requiring that accessory units be located behind the front facade of the principal structure, in other words, in the backyard. Again, in common practice, you don't usually see these in the front yard, but we don't want to open any door and let people take advantage of that. We're also proposing that parking be provided for these units and served by the same driveway as the principal structure. That'll make sure that you don't have unnecessary curb cuts that really damage the streetscape of these single-family neighborhoods. The only exception being if there's an accessory unit that's on a corner lot, maybe it's served on one street and the primary structure is served on a driveway from the other street, or similarly if there's an alley in some of our older neighborhoods. We're also making sure that we would allow only 1 accessory dwelling per lot. We don't want this to be a little micro-housing complex here with 1 principal structure and several smaller structures. And lastly, only allowing accessory units in single-family districts, so not multifamily districts. In summary, planning staff believes that appropriately designed accessory dwellings provide a benefit to the community by increasing our diversity of housing options, particularly as it relates to increasing housing affordability in the city. We did discuss these proposals in concept with the city attorney's office, and they agree that these proposals are within the bounds of our land use regulation authority. And staff also discussed these concepts with the City County Planning Board at a work session a few months ago, but at this point we haven't drafted specific text amendment language, and we haven't had any citizen engagement take place. So this is something that would obviously have to take place before we bring you all a formal text amendment. So the main thing with this item is we did want to make sure you all knew what we were working on before we went out in the community in case you received any feedback or inquiries.
Councilmember Athens.
Thank you. This goes back to what I was always saying. Everybody's going to get smaller. And the boomers who have these big houses are going to be looking for ways to at least be able to remain on their property, whether they live in an attached or a detached dwelling. I passed by a manufactured homes business the other day, and I saw all these people in the parking lots here in Winston, and they were touring. Even I turned around and came back because I wanted to see what they were looking at, and it was these tiny houses on wheels. And this brings up my question. Does this allow for the homes that are on wheels? They're like on flatbeds, and they have wheels. You even see them on television, on Facebook, but they have them now here in Winston that you can buy them, and they're calling them assisted living dwellings. I asked the gentleman, the salesperson, what did that mean? He said, this is for when mom can no longer stay in her house, and you bring her to your house, and you put this in the backyard, and it's handicapped. And I toured it. It was handicap accessible and everything done. But I'm wondering, is this part of that also? Because what we could have is, are we going to, when you say a quote-unquote appropriately designed, what does that mean?
Councilmember Adams, to answer your first question, this would not allow anything on wheels. In order to be considered a structure by our building code, it would have to be on a permanent foundation. And that would also be a requirement in terms of getting sewer and water hookups and things of those nature. So we have talked about this issue actually with our inspections arm. This could apply to things classified under the tiny house umbrella. Right. If they took the wheels off and set it on a permanent foundation.
Is that Is that written in the ordinance?
It's, I believe the building code is where that's addressed in.
Yes, but we could also, when we do draft an ordinance, we could make that clear.
But to answer your second question, which is what is appropriately designed and cited, that's where those two slides of points that I mentioned about size limitations, location limitations behind the structure, having driveway limitations, all these different things, we believe, based on looking at other ordinances in the state, that's what constitutes an appropriate accessory dwelling, rather than just giving it carte blanche to be wherever it wants on the lot or however big it wants to be, things of those natures.
And I think I commend staff on going ahead and the city attorney for going ahead and moving on this, because, you know, this is not a flash in the pan. Because of the density of cities, and we're expected to grow 120,000 in a couple of decades, everybody's not going to live outside the city. Everybody's going to want to live inside the city limits. And therefore, we've got to get now, again, more innovative as to how we allow people to have a quality of life within a structure and start to utilize these big lots that we bought back in the 60s and 70s, if we choose to do so, or if a homeowner chooses to do so, to put a unit back there, or a, what do we call it, accessory dwelling, as we move forward, particularly for this generation of baby boomers who are moving here that's over 60 and retired. I think this is a good thing for the city of Winston-Salem, and I think we're moving a little ahead of the curve of our other counterparts in doing so. Good job.
This one's got a lot of hair on it. I think I really applaud what this does for containing sprawl. You know, we've already got our infrastructure built, so I think it's an awfully positive thing in that sense. I think probably my ward has more accessory dwelling units in it than any other. West End has an awful lot. Sections of Buena Vista have an awful lot in comparison to other wards. And the tiny house movement, I think, it's real and it's here and it's going to stay. And I think it's good for us to be looking forward at housing trends and to be attractive in that standpoint. I think from the appropriately designed statement, to me, leaves a tremendous amount of vagary. And I think we have potential problems maybe with our state legislature when we get into designing, requiring design standards. But I do believe that it's important, but I think it's going to be a difficult one to, how do we approach that?
And Councilmember McIntosh, if I could also just add further to what I stated to Councilmember Adams earlier about appropriately designed, we also have set up the review process being the special use permit process. So there would be a public hearing, there would be findings of fact that this structure wouldn't have any negative impact on the neighborhood, that it would be in conformance with legacy and other adopted plans. But the main benefit of that tool is it gives individual neighborhoods the choice if they think this is appropriate for their context. You may have a place like Buena Vista where you have a 1 acre or 2 acre lot where you may be able to site one of these things within existing trees, make it hardly noticeable. You may have somewhere in West Salem where it would be an eyesore, for lack of a better term. So we wanted to make sure that we gave the appropriate tools to citizens to direct the course of action for their specific cases.
And I agree with that, but I think that will be contentious. I know that there's a case in Washington Park already about an accessory dwelling unit that has gotten people in Washington Park very fired up about it, and I think there's some real negativity about accessory dwelling units. So I do think it's going to be kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood acceptance, but I do think it's good that we were pushing on this and offering as many options as we can to people.
I respectfully disagree with my colleagues. Two things. To say that this allows a neighborhood to choose or reject this, no. It's individual property owners. And so it puts a burden on neighborhoods by allowing, to me, what is goes against our zoning ordinances. You are, in effect, allowing a single-family residentially zoned property to be multifamily in the midst of a neighborhood. So I simply would support Raleigh's, way of doing it, no accessory dwellings, because it does go against our zoning ordinances, our UDO. So did that not come up in discussion?
Again, we haven't taken this out to the public yet, but in terms of looking at precedents and things of that nature, if you look at a lot of the historic homes in areas around the city, or at least some of the larger historic homes from when our city was first starting to grow around the 1920s or so, it was a pattern in our single-family neighborhoods then to have these accessory dwellings with larger homes to provide for more opportunities. They went away for a long time during probably the late 40s, early 50s onward until maybe about 10 years ago in some of the trailblazing cities, particularly on the West Coast, Canada, places like that. But again, looking at our peer cities, a lot of them have included provisions in their current codes to allow these. So, also in terms of talking with citizens during the legacy process, a lot of them did feel like there was a need for more types of housing options than what we had currently.
As I say, I must simply disagree with all that, because if a neighborhood grows and sees itself as and is zoned as single family, then to allow someone to bring in a little mini house and put it up on blocks or whatever and rent it out destroys the whole concept of single family neighborhoods. Yes, ma'am.
I am a proponent of tiny houses and downsizing, and I am a supporter of the fact that baby boomers have lived through the big house years. And we are beyond that now. As they say, been there, done that. And again, the one thing that doesn't grow or expand, and all of us know it, is the world. Land, the ocean. Those type of resources don't grow. But people continue to grow. And we have to have somewhere to put the people versus people having expansive, or people, I won't say having them, people with resources of an expansive lot. and there's a family, or for whatever reasons, again, with the way the world is and retirement income and 401ks and the stock market, a lot of older people are finding themselves in a predicament, whereas they don't have the monies to sustain that house anymore. They might can put a dwelling outside and attach to an accessory dwelling and may be able to make this thing work until they succumb to whatever. Again, I will support this. Again, it's one of those things whereas we will tweak it along the way, but I see it as that we're moving in the right direction because we've heard nothing but we're going to grow 120,000. Like they said in the song, I don't know where 120,000 people are going to go within the city of Winston-Salem. We don't have it like that. So I think this is working in tandem with legacy and the plan and everything else. It's not perfect yet, but I think we're moving in the right direction considering all the other major cities in North Carolina have decided to do this.
I understand your negativity around the word multifamily, but I think we're in a different era. When I was fighting my battles in Holly Avenue and folks in the West End were fighting their battles against multifamily, what they were fighting was tearing down a single-family house and shotgunning in a 15, 20-unit building. Whereas this, to me, is a much more appropriate upscaling. The nature of renters has changed. Those buildings were built to house people that had nowhere else to go and they just needed a cheap place to live. I think today you're looking at people who want to be downtown, who are willing to live in a more dense environment. And I think as long as you leave control at the neighborhood level, then I think you get an appropriate feedback and appropriate control over what is built.
But this ordinance does not have any control at the neighborhood level.
Is that correct?
The mechanism is the Board of Adjustment process, and I'd have to leave it to the attorney's office to establish who exactly has standing, but it's more than just the property owner. Obviously, people within that neighborhood, at least to a certain degree, are affected by any intervention in that neighborhood, and I know each case is different in establishing standing, as you all remember from the cell tower cases we had last year. But there is a mechanism in place for a public hearing, for findings of fact, for sworn testimony. So this isn't just a legislative decision where it's one person's word against another.
But in fact, the city is right now in a lawsuit claiming a neighborhood does not have standing on this very issue.
I'll be happy to speak on that, but perhaps better to have a closed session to discuss the lawsuit. But,
all right.
But that's not quite exactly correct, but I can clarify.
I would not support it without strong ability to control at the neighborhood level.
And I'll just add that compatibility is one of the elements of the findings that have to be made in order to issue a use permit. So the petitioner, in that case, is going to have to show how they're going, how they're placing it, how they're putting it, how tall is the building, what's it going to look like, how is that compatible with its surroundings there, which is one of the findings.
Of course, the key in a compatibility finding is, are you making that as a legislative decision or as a quasi-judicial? If you're making it as a quasi-judicial decision, the opinion of neighbors doesn't count. So I think the point that conceptually, as presented here, there's little or no neighborhood level involvement in the decision making is probably true. I have no problem with the conversation going forward. I'm not sure I'll support it in the final analysis. I'm going to be interested in the public opinion and viewpoint as discussed in the process.
You have
I have one last comment. Again, I just think, as we move forward in this city and this world, we need to open our minds a little bit more and be more responsive and receptive to other people and the world changing around us. If this is left up, let's say it just happens to fall that communities get to decide, I can almost bet money on how this will be decided. And I would hope not, but I would think it may end up that way, that the people with the most resources will not want it because it'll change their way of life and control. The people with the least resources who just want to be a part of what everybody else is a part of will want this badly. Because now, instead of the least of us having to move now to the suburbs, we might get to stay in the city and be a part of all of this and benefit from it. But as we say, that's my closing comment, and we'll see how this moves forward from the opinion of the public.
What do you need from us, Kirk?
This was more informational at this point. No action was required. The main thing is we just wanted to keep you abreast of this process in case you got any calls or comments from your constituents as we establish public information sessions on this and take it forward with our planning board and ultimately bring it back to committee sometime later this year.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done report. G3.
Item G3, report on special event permitting process.
Mr. Brooks?
This is a good one.
Council members, several months ago, there were major revisions made to the permitting process that we believe improved how it operated, and we thought were enhancements that would just, in general, make that process a lot better and more user-friendly. It was placed on the city's webpage. The application process is color-coded. I think it's a real nice revision that was made to it to make it a lot, as I say, more friendly, customer-friendly. Part of that process involved changing the notification process, because at that time we were getting considerable complaints about the notification process, which at that time was a 14-day period. Now the notification process was extended from 14 to 30 days. And we believe since it has been expanded to 30 days and we now require a notarized affidavit to be submitted by the applicants, that process has improved tremendously. The number of complaints that we receive have decreased considerably, and we believe that for the most part it's working pretty well. However, we have gotten some concerns expressed about it, and I think a lot of it, from my opinion, has to do with the repetition that it was occurring in neighborhoods. Now you can only have a special permit 2 times, and it's limited, and that's based on the road closures and the resources that's available to do it, so you don't have individuals in neighborhoods having to be inconvenienced, if you will, by these events or races very often. So we think that's working pretty well. However, we have gotten some complaints still about that notification process and just felt that we should bring it back to you and give you this report to see if you wanted further work on that process. Of course, it has lengthened it, but we think by adding this extra time, it has given the event applicant enough time to actually go around and make the proper notifications and let folks know about these events far enough in advance so if there's any planning that needs to be done, it can be done. So that's the first process.
Let me interrupt at this point. Is there any requirement as to how that notification is done? Like, do they have to put door hangers on all the properties that will be impacted, or it's just somehow notify them?
They are required to visit the site, and they submit an affidavit with names and addresses of folks that they've contacted, and that has to be notarized.
I wonder if that notification process would be, because I've certainly heard from people saying, well, I didn't know about it, that sort of thing. And of course, we know how that happens, but also to be able to say, yes, a door hanger or a flyer was put on your door, on every door on the route. It's just something to consider. Yeah.
How long has the new process been in place?
Approximately a little over 7 or 8 months. It was a year ago, so
Right.
Not quite a year.
And
Not quite a year.
has there been, what's the level of feedback been from the general public? I mean, we get people coming in saying, well, it used to be 30 days and now it's longer. I mean, is there much pushback on that in that regard?
No. We've gotten far less complaints about the extending the period from 14 to 30 days and far less complaints from individuals about the process.
I think probably two of the most affected places are Old Salem and Runnymede Road in my ward. There's really pretty places and people want to have their events there. Also, I think anything we can do to push some of the business and some of these events to the fairgrounds would be wonderful. I mean, it's a great facility. It's, we're getting ready to make it even better. Plus, it's sort of a neutral ground. If we can push events in that direction, I think we'll all be better off.
What we've attempted to do is identify at least 3 or 4 additional routes that we can offer to individuals as alternative routes for them to use, so that you won't have everyone using the same route in the downtown area. Quite frankly, folks that's the area that they want most, but we are looking at additional routes that we'll be able to offer them instead of the ones that we have now.
Dan.
Yeah, I have actually heard a lot from the other side, from event sponsors and would-be block party, neighborhood block party sponsors, with some very specific concerns about the new process. And I can go through what they have complained of to me. The notarized affidavit is one, but that's probably depends on what you're being required to notarize to attest to. But the requirement to make notifications to all area businesses and residents affected by the special event, since, as I understand it, these are standards adopted administratively as opposed to by council rule.
It's actually in the ordinance.
All right. There appears to be a substantial amount of discretion being applied to the question of affected. Who is affected? For example, event sponsors in the Ardmore area have told me that previously they were required to notify all the households along an event route. Now they were being required, in some cases they indicate, to notify all the households potentially affected by the traffic stoppage. And how do you define that? But the costs, and they were talking, whether they were actually getting this requirement, or whether they simply perceived that they were being required, I don't know. But they were talking about being required to do first-class mailing to all the households in a substantial block of area, and for a small fundraising event, for a cancer fundraiser, for example. The cost of that alone can make the event cost prohibitive. So we need some guidelines, I think, for how you define affected by the event. And the question of how you can notify. In fact, for these volunteer-heavy events, door hangers would be to their advantage, as opposed to me. And they'd certainly like to have that. that option, particularly if affected by the event is defined by the route as opposed to by who could conceivably be affected by traffic stoppage when the route crosses, say, Nowood Street. The other thing, 30 days prior to the event is how it reads, but I had people coming to me and saying we're being required to submit something 60 days, and in fact on the form it made reference to a preliminary submission of 60 days. Final submission 30 days in advance. And I'm not aware of any grounds for that preliminary submission 60 days. Yeah. So it seemed like they had a reasonable complaint on that.
Yeah.
And then there's some other points down in the neighborhood block.
Yeah, we haven't let Mr. Brooks finish on that, but yeah, it might be worth taking a look at that. Is the requirement for first-class mailing in our, no.
Not in the ordinance.
No, so it seems.
How to do it. It's just
No.
you certify that you've done it. And the affected area, again, it goes back to, I think, in large part to all the complaints that were received based upon the prior ordinance, where you were, in fact, just notifying the folks whose property were adjacent to the route. Then you had other folks blocks over who were impacted because they were trying to get out of their property and trying to leave and so forth. So how you define it, again, it might be
that's
subjective to.
Yeah, and that's a real question. And if you're talking about a major thoroughfare through a neighborhood and an event route crosses it at one point, you could argue that half the city is potentially affected. And of course, if you do that, though, then you prohibit special events that use the streets, which I don't think we want to do.
No.
So I would urge a limited definition of affected to directly affected. Now, there are ways that you can address the real problems that we were having with Runnymede, which is a repeat racing route, and some of the downtown streets that were repeat routes. And that's where I think the real problem was coming in. Is that there were a limited number of neighborhoods that were getting hammered every weekend, and we may have gone overboard in the fix.
Yeah, well, and in fact, I know, for example, just the Old Salem is an example, blocking Academy Street going across the route, in effect, blocks the only way into Old Salem. And I say businesses, but in fact, there's only one business. Couldn't get their workers in to work in the restaurant and that sort of thing. But I will say that since that was brought up with the city manager and Chief Roundtree, it has, they've been able to let traffic through in gaps in races and whatever. So the last 6 months, year, whatever, I've noticed a very much an increase or decrease in complaints about that. So, yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Brooks. I'd be interested to know when these events are going on, the resources, they pay for them, the people, okay. I agree with Councilmember McIntosh to a certain degree. I have nothing against people running all over the place, but when you get hundreds, possibly thousands of people running every weekend on almost the same streets, it does cause a problem to those property owners that live in those neighborhoods. I think we do, just like you're doing, we need to revisit this, because if we have areas of the city that are the least impacted, and let's say that a community may want to come forward and put an ordinance in, just like no parking or the accessory dwellings, and say, we want our community taken off the list of people being able to schedule their run-throughs of our neighborhoods every Saturday. Maybe they got data to prove that out of a year or 6 months, they might have 20 coming through. And we all know that sometimes there are 2 or 3 or 5 of these things going on in the city simultaneously. I think we do need to look at how we are able to, again, find some kind of win-win with everybody, and that we look at other places that are not so much impacting communities and property owners and neighborhoods. And if we move them to areas like the north end of town, which is a fairground, BB&T Stadium, the Coliseum, Reynolds Boulevard, because nobody's working, it's wide open. And there are other places like that, I'm sure, in town. But I think Mr. Garrity and Mr. Brooks, we just might, for grins, take a look and see what we can find, because I know everybody wants to run where it's pretty. But if those property owners decide to stop you, you might want to think about looking other places just in case in the future.
I would agree, and I think that's the reason why the number was limited, and certainly which number is best for the neighborhood is subjective. But we can take another look at that, and offering other sites is somewhat different than offering as opposed to closing locations where you can have them.
Yeah.
So you can encourage someone to take the other sites, but unless we have a more forceful means or a mechanism to have them go there, then that's all it is making these sites available, unless we're going to, as I say, be more forceful in how we approach it.
And certainly, I think that limiting any one area to twice a year is a very good tool. That doesn't stop old cars, shows, and whatever, but at least, I think that's much better than the multiple times a year. Opt out, to be able to say, I don't want anything in my neighborhood. I don't think I like that, because they're public streets.
Chairman, like that's twice a month.
Twice a month?
Yep.
Oh.
We don't allow more than 2 events per day in the city total, because if you have, we can't, the resources, police and all, but,
Yeah.
but as far as in the same neighborhood,
Yes.
more than 2 per month.
Oh, okay. Did I say per year?
Yes, you said.
Oh, okay. Okay, all right.
Rather than talking about sort of police force and police action on it, maybe we develop a system of incentives where the cost to do it on a public street maybe rises a little bit, and the cost of doing it at the fairgrounds decreases. So there's a financial incentive to hold it on the fairgrounds, and maybe tweak the system that way a little bit.
Any other comments from Mr. Brooks on this? Oh, okay. Gosh, you didn't even get halfway through. Okay.
No, that's good, because this would normally be presented by Ken Millett, who's the primary staff person assigned to this. So I'm a fill-in today.
Okay.
Neighborhood block parties. As you know, the ordinance does address neighborhood block parties, and I think the most significant issue that we've been dealing with here is the insurance requirement that's required on these neighborhood block parties, and that's specifically when you have some commercial activity associated with it, catering, generally the bouncy houses, and there are some exceptions. And the exception would be for the paying for having that insurance would be, number one, if it occurs outside of the central business district and it does not involve the commercial services. And those commercial services are defined as caterers, live entertainment, or inflatable bouncy houses. And the inflatable bouncy houses are the ones that we generally have the most problems with in terms of that. Then the second issue is the insurance for the barricades. Prior to the revisions made, the barricades were provided by the Recreation Department, and they were only $50. The barricades that were being provided were not DOT-approved barricades,
Right.
which you are supposed to use on the public streets. So with the revisions, we are now requiring individuals to have the proper barricades, and the cost for those barricades are $300 because they have to get them from our transportation department. and their cost is $300 to set them up and take them down. So that's been an issue, and we tried to assist in that in some where we have community days and block parties that may be co-sponsored by some city department. Some of that cost is covered, but when it's not, that $300 is a cost that is charged to the neighborhood for sponsoring that, and it's
Can be
expensive.
prohibitive.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Yeah. Mr. Bessie?
Two points here from sort of the complaint perspective that I've been getting. One is the insurance requirement exception is insufficiently clear on the application form or the rules that they're being given. If that can be made, if the exemption there can be made clearer so that folks know, that's great.
Okay.
And the other is the point that you just acknowledged, and that is that $300 for an afternoon block party on a residential street is essential. That's prohibited. That means no more block parties on neighborhood streets. And in my opinion, that is bad policy, and we should change that.
I think that's DOT.
Well,
It's not legal.
It's a city, it's
a
the
legal dictate.
DOT doesn't make the final decision. Council can set the fee at whatever they would like to.
I would ask, what process do I need to do to make the motion to send us back to $50 and $300?
My thought is we bring it all back, and maybe in a little table matrix showing all the different pieces of it and the things that you suggested, as well with some changes on the forms, and I think we could bring that with it.
That'd be great. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just one clarification on the insurance piece. If they do have those commercial activities, 9 times out of 10, the provider will have the insurance that's required. So it's not like the neighborhood is looking to actually purchase.
They have a bouncy house.
You want the bouncy guy to have the insurance.
Yes.
That was made clear on
Okay. That makes more sense. Mr. Brooks, thank you very much. So we'll look forward to the next iteration.
Thank you all.
All right. Does anybody on the committee have anything else to bring up? Yes, ma'am.
I would like to possibly have Mr. Garrity direct staff to look at, again, what does our city look like, and you can do it with a color code map of businesses that produce hazardous material, whether they shut the doors tomorrow or 20 years from now. It won't be like we can use that land for much. I think we need to start looking proactively ahead as to, again, we bring in 120,000 people. We might not like the accessory dwelling, but they got to go somewhere. So I think we need to start looking at that, because if you drive through our city, based on a year ago, there are new automobile repair shops. There are new cleaning businesses. There are new businesses that are cropping up. I understand the need of humanity, but I think we need to be a little bit more diligent as to, it's our responsibility to look after the city of Winston-Salem. We might can't control what the state and the feds do, but I would hate for us to be 20 years from now and people say, why didn't they do something? Why didn't somebody just look at it? And that includes crematoriums and everybody that puts contaminants in our ground, in the land.
Thank you. Just on that same subject, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that after the paint store fire or chemical whatever fire, I think EMS did a pretty big survey. I hope I'm not mistaken.
After the car wash, yes,
Yeah.
we do have a lot of information.
So there is that. The problem I see, I hear all the time about people doing backyard car repair stuff, and they just, dump the oil on the ground, pour it in the drain, whatever. So And no one's ever going to know about that unless the neighbors have complained. So, yeah, you wish we could know what we're putting into our ground.
Well, and we do have an ongoing issue right now about a crematorium that's in a very dense residential neighborhood.
Yep.
That is allowed there by our current zoning ordinance,
Mhm.
but it has a major impact on residents. Nobody did anything wrong, but the impact on residential community is fairly significant. That we're going to have to work our way through.
The ashes drifting down.
You don't want to know.
Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, all right. If there is nothing else, we're adjourned.